A 19-year-old walks into a shop on a dusty street in Da Nang in 1968, hands a Vietnamese engraver a $2 Zippo lighter and a scrap of paper, and waits. What he has written on that paper is not his mother's name. It is not a Bible verse. It is a joke about his own death, the kind of joke you only make when you have run out of other ways to say it. 20 minutes later, he walks out with the sentence cut into the steel, drops it in his pocket, and carries it for the next 11 months. 58 years later, that lighter is sitting in a collector's display case in Ohio, and it is still saying it. Today we're opening the file on the strangest personal document of the Vietnam War, the engraved Zippo lighter. What the men actually had cut into them. The black humor, the fatalism, the defiance, the maps, the tour dates that read like prison sentences. Why an object that had nothing to do with combat became the single most personal thing a grunt carried. The dozen jobs a lighter did in the field that had nothing to do with cigarettes. The famous story about a Zippo stopping a bullet. And why, today, the market for these things is so flooded with fakes that even museums have to be careful. If these files are worth your time, do us a favor. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It helps the channel more than you know. Start with the object itself, because the Zippo was already a legend before Vietnam. The company had been making the lighters in Bradford, Pennsylvania since the 1930s, built around a design that solved the one problem every other lighter had: wind. The Zippo's rectangular case and the chimney of holes around the wick meant a flame that stayed lit outdoors, in weather, in a breeze, which is why it went to war in the first place. During the Second World War, Zippo converted essentially its entire production to the military, and the lighter came home from that war attached to a generation of veterans. Then came Korea. Then came Vietnam. By the 1960s, the Zippo had two qualities that mattered more than fire. It was cheap, a couple of dollars, easily replaced, small enough to forget you were carrying it. And it was made of solid plated brass or steel with a flat, blank surface on both sides. It was, in other words, an accidental canvas, a durable metal object issued into the hands of 500,000 young Americans a year, with two clean faces begging to be written on. That's the mechanical reason the engraved Vietnam Zippo exists. But the reason it became a cultural artifact is different, and it starts with a simple, brutal fact of life in that war. A grunt owned almost nothing. Think about what a soldier in the field actually had. His weapon belonged to the Army. His uniform belonged to the Army. His helmet, his web gear, his rucksack, his poncho. All issued, all interchangeable, all stamped with somebody else's system. He slept on the ground and carried everything he owned on his back, and the rule of the bush was that weight was the enemy. Every ounce had to earn its place. Photos got ruined by the wet. Letters fell apart. There was no room for keepsakes and nowhere to keep them. And into that vacuum came a $2 lighter that weighed almost nothing, survived anything, sat in a pocket, and could be personalized permanently for a few more dollars in any town in Vietnam. It was the only object a grunt could make his own. So he did, and what he chose to say is why we're still talking about them. The engravings fall into recognizable families, and the first one is dark humor, men making jokes about their own deaths, in the second person, to be read by whoever picked the lighter up. The most famous of them all is a piece of grim doggerel that turns up over and over in variations on lighters and helmet covers and flak jackets across the war. The line about walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil, because in the soldier's version, you are the meanest thing in that valley. Another one, so common it became almost a signature of the era, describes the men as the unwilling, led by the unqualified, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. A sentiment about the whole enterprise that thousands of drafted teenagers found funny because the alternative was not funny at all. There were shorter, harder ones too. When I die, I'll go to heaven because I've spent my time in hell. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil, for I am the evilest son of a bitch in the valley. Read that again and notice what's actually happening. A 19-year-old is having a joke about dying permanently cut into metal in a shop by a stranger, and then carrying it against his body every day. It is bravado, and it is terror, and it is the same thing. Combat soldiers have always used gallows humor as armor. The Vietnam generation just happened to have a cheap engraving industry sitting right outside the gate. The second family is the calendar, and it's the one that hits hardest once you know what you're looking at. Enormous numbers of Vietnam Zippos are engraved with a place and a pair of dates, a unit, a province, a base camp, and then something like 1968, 1969. Sometimes with the months, sometimes with the exact day of arrival and the exact day the man was supposed to leave. As we covered in a previous file, every American in Vietnam served a fixed individual tour with a personal exit date, and the entire psychology of that war ran on counting down to it. So a man got his beginning and his end engraved onto a piece of steel before he knew whether he'd live to reach the second date. That's not a souvenir. That's a man betting on his own survival in writing. The third family is geography. Vietnam Zippos are covered in place names: Da Nang, Chu Lai, Pleiku, Khe San, An Khe, Cu Chi, the Delta, the DMZ. Many were engraved with a rough outline map of Vietnam itself, sometimes with the man's route or his unit's area of operations marked on it. Others carried unit crests, division patches, jump wings, the cavalry hat, the skull and crossbones of a reconnaissance outfit. And then there were the ones with a woman's name, or a wife's, or a child's, the men who chose the opposite of gallows humor and had the reason they intended to come home cut into the metal instead. Put those together and you understand what the object really was. A lighter that says Cu Chi, 1968-69, 25th Infantry Division, with a joke about hell on the other side, is a complete autobiography of a year on something the size of a matchbox, written by a man who had no other way to leave a record. And here's what makes it a genuinely strange artifact of the war. He wasn't the one who made it. The engraving was done overwhelmingly by Vietnamese civilians. Every base of any size had shops and stalls just outside the gate, and inside the big installations too, where local craftsmen would cut whatever an American wrote on a slip of paper into the face of a lighter, usually by hand with a simple graver, sometimes with a small machine. They worked fast and they worked cheap. It was one of the small economies that grew up around the American presence, and it produced a peculiar collaboration. A Vietnamese engraver in Da Nang, cutting an American teenager's joke about killing and dying into steel, for money day after day for both of their wars. Some engravers reportedly kept books of popular sayings that GIs could point to and pick from, which is exactly why the same handful of lines show up on thousands of surviving lighters. This was, in a real sense, a mass-produced folk art with a very small number of authors and a very large number of buyers. Now let's talk about what the lighter actually did, because in the field the Zippo was less a personal keepsake than a tool that happened to have your soul written on it. It lit cigarettes, obviously. And in an era when the Army handed out cigarettes in the ration accessory packet, a huge percentage of the force smoked. But the real work was elsewhere. It was the fastest way to light a heat tab or a fire under a canteen cup. It burned leeches off a man's skin, one of the few field methods that made the animal let go on its own instead of leaving its mouthparts embedded in the wound. It sterilized the point of a needle before somebody dug a splinter or a thorn out of a hand. It melted the cut end of a nylon cord so it wouldn't fray, and it dried a wet wick, and it lit the C4 that, as we covered in another file, became the field stove of the entire war. It gave a man light in a bunker, in a hole, in the dark when nothing else did. It was a signal in an emergency, a heat source for the field expedient repairs a soldier makes on his own gear, and, critically, it was a way to see your watch at 3 in the morning without turning on a flashlight and painting a target on your position. And there is one use of the Zippo in Vietnam that has to be named because it attached itself to the object permanently, and it is the reason the lighter carries a shadow that the tomahawk and the canteen cup never picked up. In operations where villages and hamlets were destroyed, The lighter was sometimes the tool that did it. Thatch roofs lit by hand, one after another. Press footage of it reached American living rooms, and the phrase Zippo raid entered the language of the war. The riverine boats fitted with flamethrowers got called Zippo monitors for the same reason. That history is real, and this file isn't going to pretend it away. But it also isn't the story of the object, and it's worth being precise about why. The same lighter in the same pocket was a stove, a watch light, a signal, and a diary, carried by hundreds of thousands of men who never burned anything but a heat tab with it. An object used by 500,000 people ends up carrying everything those people did, at their best and at their worst. The engravings are the part of that record the men wrote themselves. And it worked wet. That's the part that made it different from every match and every disposable lighter in the world. A Zippo could be soaked in a patty, dried on a shirt, snapped open, and struck. And it would light. It needed refilling constantly, and the fluid came in the mail and in the PX, and eventually in every care package America sent to Vietnam. But it never failed the way electronics failed, and the way paper failed, and the way everything else in that climate failed. Here's the reality of it, in the field, at night. You're in a night defensive position, and it's your watch. Everything is black. There's a rule about light. No visible flame after dark, because a flare of orange in a tree line is a gift to anyone out there with a rifle, so the lighter stays in your pocket. But at some point in the small hours, when the arithmetic of the watch schedule gets unbearable and you need to know how long you have left, you cup both hands around the Zippo, get down under your poncho liner, and snap it open inside the tent of your own body. One flick. In that orange half-second, you see the face of your watch, and you also see, because it's right there in your hand, the sentence you paid a man in Da Nang $3 to cut into the steel, the joke about dying that you thought was funny back in month 2. You read your own handwriting from another life. Then you close the lid, and the dark comes back, and the smell of lighter fluid stays on your fingers for the rest of the watch. There's one more piece of Zippo mythology we have to handle honestly, because it's the single most searched thing about these lighters. The story that a Zippo in a shirt pocket stopped a bullet and saved a soldier's life. The stories exist. There are lighters in collections and in the Zippo Company's own museum in Bradford with deep dents and gouges in them, and veterans' accounts attached to them describing exactly that. Whether a lighter can reliably stop a rifle round is a different question, and the honest answer is, mostly, no. A brass case a few millimeters thick isn't going to stop a high-velocity rifle bullet at close range, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What a Zippo could plausibly do is deflect or absorb a spent round, a ricochet, or shell fragmentation. And in a war where most wounds came from fragments rather than aimed rifle fire, that isn't a small category. So the myth is not fabricated, it's overgeneralized. Some men were saved by an object in a pocket. That object was sometimes a Zippo, sometimes a Bible, sometimes a can of sea rations, sometimes a belt buckle. The Zippo just had better branding. And that brings us to the last chapter, which is what happened to these things after the war. Because it's the strangest part of all. The engraved Vietnam Zippo became one of the most collected military artifacts in the world. Books were published on them. Sherry Buchanan's Vietnam Zippos collected hundreds of the engravings as a kind of accidental war literature. Museums display them. Collectors pay serious money for authentic examples with good provenance, a real lighter carried by a real man with his unit and his year on it, which created the inevitable outcome, the market flooded with fakes. Vietnam-era Zippos are now among the most heavily counterfeited collectibles in militaria. Old cases get new engravings. New cases get artificially aged with acid and tumbling and heat. Whole workshops produce Vietnam lighters with plausible units and plausible dates and plausible dents. The counterfeits are good enough that serious collectors learn to date the case itself. Zippo stamped codes into the bottom of every lighter that identify the year of manufacture. And even that can be defeated by engraving a genuine period case today. Experienced collectors and museums treat unprovenanced examples with real caution, and the safest lighters are the ones that never left the family that owned them. Think about what that means. The most personal object of that war, the one thing a grunt could truly call his own, is now so valuable that there is an industry manufacturing fake versions of other men's private thoughts. So the next time you see one of these behind glass, a scratched, dented, tarnished piece of brass with a unit and a date and a bad joke cut into it, you'll know what you're actually looking at. Not a lighter, a 19-year-old's only piece of property in a country where he owned nothing else, engraved by a Vietnamese craftsman he never learned the name of, carried in a pocket for 365 days, and used to check a watch at 3 in the morning while he counted the ones he had left. He wrote a joke about dying on it, because that was the only way to say the true thing out loud. And the metal outlasted the war, outlasted the argument about the war, and in a lot of cases outlasted the man. If you served, this record belongs to you. What did you have engraved on yours? And where did you get it done? Did your outfit have a shop everybody used? And what happened to it? Is it still in a drawer somewhere, or did it get lost in a war that lost a lot of things? Put it in the comments. The best story in these comments becomes a future file. If this one was worth your time, leave a like. It pushes these stories in front of more of the people who lived them. Share it with somebody whose father still has one, because this history is too strange and too human to stay buried. And subscribe for more of what they didn't put in the textbooks. To the men who wrote their own epitaphs on a $2 lighter and then came home to prove them wrong, this file was for you.